Hi, my name is Tamer Bahram and I am a trainer with Atlas Institute. So the purpose of this video is to essentially introduce learners to the assessment criteria and the grading criteria, and I'll be covering each one of those for level 2, 4 and 5. So to begin with, I'll start with level 2, unit 17, starting a small business. In this video, I'll take you through the various assessment criteria and I'll give you examples on how to essentially cover them successfully in order to pass the module and the unit. So starting off with assessment criteria P4. Now here you're required to describe the financial aspect of a business, and in choosing a business you may want to focus on a service company such as a restaurant. While you're required to do this, bear in mind that you have to have 6 things in mind. So we'll start with part 1. So part 1, learners will have to produce 2 lists. List 1 will be a tabular format where you will be required to essentially list all the capital requirements. And in doing so, you will be expected to include things such as capital requirement, which is the capital outlay that you need in order to successfully start a restaurant. Now, in table 2, you'll have to include your expenses, which is your running expenses in order to manage your business. Here, things that you might want to include would be, for example, the marketing cost, sales costs, expenses, your kitchen equipment, which is your requirement in order to manage a restaurant. Other things such as dining expenses, delivery, vehicle expenses, and other operating expenses such as salaries, staff expenses, and so on. So in part 1, once you've done that, we move on to part 2. In part 2, you're required to explain in detail the pricing policy of your restaurant. Things that you might want to include here will be the pricing of the products, or rather the goods that you're selling in your restaurant. Other things such as bargaining power, the bundling, if you have any special days where you have special discounts to the customers that walk into your restaurant. In part 3, you'll have to explain using numeric figures and calculate the break-even point. Now in break-even point, you're required to show in great detail explanation of what break-even analysis is. You might want to plug in the formula in there too, and in doing so you will be showing to the examiner that you have a thorough understanding of all the costs that are required in order to set up a business. Moving on to part 4, learners here are expected to produce a cash flow forecast. Now a cash flow forecast essentially details all the cash inflows that are coming to your business from the sale of the services, or rather the meals in the restaurant example that I used earlier. Other things you would have to bear in mind is that you have to have at least 2 charts. Chart 1 will include the cash inflow items, and chart 2 will include the cash flow items. Then we move on to part 5. Now in part 5, students are expected to produce a profit and loss account using the income statement items. So things that you would include in your profit and loss account would be your revenues, expenses, and a net profit for every month. Now, when you're producing a profit and loss account, bear in mind that you use tabular formats in order to show your revenues and expenses clearly. Then we move on to part 6. Now, in part 6, which is the final part, you are required to explain the financial sources that you use in order to set up your business, and you'll have to discuss both the internal sources of finance and external sources of finance. Now, internal sources of finance will be those that refer to the money that you use, such as sale of assets, reducing your working capital. In addition to that, you might want to consider short-term internal sources of finance, such as customer advances, financing, factoring, rewards, and so on and so forth. And in addition to this, you will have to explain the external sources of finance. Now, external sources of finance would include money that you loan from your friends, family, in addition to the capital that the proprietor or the sole trader introduces himself. And in doing so, you would have covered P4. Now, we move on to M3. Now, under this assessment criteria, candidates are required to discuss the break-even point alongside the formula. Furthermore, you'll have to discuss things such as the need for a break-even point. You might want to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of break-even point. In addition, you might want to write the advantages and disadvantages of various sources of finance. Now, I've mentioned earlier that you have internal and external sources of finance. So do go in great detail in describing the advantages and disadvantages of both sources of finance. The candidates are required at this level, at merit level 3, to essentially provide a detailed analysis. So that wraps up the assessment criteria.